Everybody, this is Miss Peachy from WCA Biology B, and today we are looking at Unit 3, Lesson 2, Cycling of Matter and Energy. So we are starting a new unit here in the second semester of biology, and we are going to be looking at kind of more in depth into that ecology, the study of living things within their environment that we started within the first unit. As always, look below the video link in my website here, and there should be a link to a study guide, a note sheet for this particular lesson. So our keywords, and there are many, are autotroph, cellular respiration, consumer, decomposer, detritivore, food chain, food web, heterotroph, law of conservation of mass, matter, omnivore, photosynthesis, and producer. So I'm hoping a lot of these terms actually look somewhat familiar to you now. So what I like about second semester biology is that we are looking more at a study of macrobiology, if you will, things that are affect um, organisms as a whole versus looking at kind of body systems or looking at cellular function and processes within the cell. So it becomes somewhat more familiar to you and something that you may have some experience with or a lot of background knowledge, and it helps with understanding a bit better. So that being said, we first start off about talking about the law of conservation of matter because this leads us to the discussion of how matter or mass, if you will, is recycled within an ecosystem. So matter is anything that takes up space, and mass, anything that's made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, is considered to be matter, right? And that matter can be recycled throughout an ecosystem. And we're going to kind of look at that because it doesn't just go away. It's not something that can be created or destroyed. It has to be recycled and regenerated. We will be looking at energy as well. And what we will see is that energy in an ecosystem flows in one direction and it cannot be recycled. So while energy is conserved, it's generally lost as heat throughout metabolic processes and through things like decomposition. And so you can't recycle energy within an ecosystem, but you can recycle matter. So let's understand kind of the components of an ecosystem first. The different kind of levels of we call them trophic levels of organisms. And trophic levels is not one of your vocab terms yet, but it will be coming in future lessons. So we have organisms that are classified as like main groups. Remember, biology loves to classify stuff, right? So we have autotrophs and we have heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that make their own food. Auto means self. So the automobile is a vehicle that's self-propelled, unlike a horse and buggy, which needs a horse, right? The automobile or the auto is self-propelled, and that's why it's called that. Heterotrophs mean they obtain uh, food from their environment, and they have to be, they consume something in order to get their food. So then it reminds us of some processes we've learned about previously, the process of photosynthesis and the process of cellular respiration, right? Because photosynthesis is how photoautotrophs make their own food. Not all autotrophs are photoautotrophic. So this isn't necessarily explicitly stated in this part of the lesson. Autotrophs that use the sun to be able to make their own food using photosynthesis are known as photoautotrophs. There's a whole separate category of autotrophs that don't use the sun. They tend to live in very extreme environments like hydrothermal vents or, down in the depths of a volcano or something like that. And they are called chemoautotrophs. They use chemicals to make their own food. We don't typically talk much about chemoautotrophs, and we definitely don't talk about chemosynthesis in biology 1 here, but just know that it exists, right? So they use the process of photosynthesis I take that back. They actually specifically talk about certain bacteria here. They just don't use the term chemosynthesis or chemoautotrophs. So these are also known as producers. So when we look at our note sheet, bring that forward, we have our types of organisms. You want to make sure you realize that your autotrophs are the same thing as your producers. Okay, they are the same. I just want to make sure that we use them interchangeably. They mean the same thing. All right. So then we look at the process of cellular respiration. Now, this is something that is in the lesson that I do not necessarily agree with here. Okay, I'm putting a little note in. I try to flag it. We'll see how this gets altered in the future. But it talks about how heterotrophs use cellular respiration. And this is true. Heterotrophs do use cellular respiration, but so do autotrophs. All aerobic organisms use aerobic respiration, and all anaerobic organisms use anaerobic respiration. All organisms use some form of respiration, whether you're a plant or an animal or a bacteria or a fungi or whatever. Respiration is always going to be used because while plants make their own food with photosynthesis, they then need to break that food down to use the energy to make ATP using cellular respiration. So I'm hoping we can get this altered in the lesson, but this paragraph kind of misleads you into thinking that cellular respiration is exclusive to heterotrophs. It isn't. They just don't do photosynthesis. So we're going to make a little asterisk here, and we're going to say that all organisms use cellular respiration to be able to take the food, the sugar, and to use the energy that's stored in that sugar to manufacture ATP. That's the process. That's the purpose of cellular respiration. It is, yes, done by heterotrophs, but it is not exclusively done by heterotrophs. Autotrophs do this as well. So please keep that in mind. So heterotrophs are also known as consumers. So on that notes guide, you can put heterotrophs equals consumers, right? That's two kind of synonyms for each other. They can be things like carnivores that just eat meat. They can be herbivores that just eat plants, or they can be omnivores that eat plants and animals. It says most humans are omnivorous or omnivores. That is true as well. We also use the word heterotrophs to describe them as consumers. And we will also talk a little bit later about different orders of consumers. Are you just a plant eater? Are you an eater of a plant eater? Etc., etc. There are various levels of consumers that we will refer to later. Another group of organisms we have are those that break down dead material. So detritivores, such as earthworms, feed on dead organic matter and contribute to the decomposition and nutrient cycles. Decomposers break down dead or decaying organisms. So they're very, very similar to one another. A detritivore literally just eats dead stuff, and a decomposer takes that dead stuff and actually breaks it down into simpler chemical reactions that break that dead material down into simpler molecules and stuff that can be recycled into the environment. So this is where that recycling of matter comes into play. Both detritivores by eating it, but then decomposers specifically by breaking it down into something that's simpler. Decomposers, for example, are certain bacterias and fungi. They can actually break down organic material into simpler chemicals, simpler compounds to be able to be used later on. And they're kind of cool on how they do it. And now we see the term trophic level here. So the flow of energy in an ecosystem can be modeled using either a food chain or a food web. A food chain is just a part of a food web. So a food web consists of every single organism that lives in an ecosystem and their relationship to each other. It starts with the sun as the primary producer, the producer of energy, right? And then every arrow that connects the sun to a producer, an autotroph. And then those autotrophs, every consumer of the autotrophs is connected to them. And then you can connect arrows to consumers of and it gets to be kind of complex, but you see all the different relationships. If you follow just one pathway in a food web, you'll end up with a food chain. So if you food chain is going to show just one of those. Okay, so I want to show you kind of a picture of that. If I look here on my whiteboard, you can see the difference between a food web and a food chain. So in our food web over to the right, the sun's energy flows to our consumer, which is the plant. The plant is then eaten by the primary consumer, which is the grasshopper. So plant is the producer, grasshopper is the primary consumer. The grasshopper can be eaten by multiple things. It can be eaten by a hawk, it can be eaten by a spider, it can be eaten by a shrew, it can be eaten by the weasel. So there's multiple pathways that it can follow, right? So it becomes kind of all kind of interconnected in what's known as the food web. If we follow just one of those pathways, producer to grasshopper to frog to snake to hawk, then it's just one potential pathway of that energy as it flows through the ecosystem. That's what's known as the food chain. So they're not separate entities altogether, they're just components of each other. Food chain being a component of the larger food web. So I wanted to give you an example of that. Okay. When we look at our food chain or food web, we notice different levels of consumers as we move through it. So again, looking at this picture, the producer is the grass. That's what is actually an autotroph. It's taking energy from the sun, it's taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water, and it's making some sugars in there, and some starches are being manufactured from the sugars. That is eaten by our grasshopper. Our grasshopper here is our primary consumer. It's the very first consumer in the chain, so it becomes primary. The primary consumer is eaten by the frog here. He's a secondary consumer because he's second in line. He's eating the grasshopper. So the energy now has been transferred from the grass to the grasshopper and now further being transferred to the frog. The frog is then eaten by the snake. So the snake becomes a tertiary consumer. Tertiary means third order. So you can actually even say third order consumer if you don't want to have to memorize the word tertiary, but it means third order. And then finally, our last level, our fourth order or quaternary, or they're calling it the final consumer here, is the hawk. The decomposers, so the matter is eventually broken back down by decomposers, bacteria, and fungi. So they're adding those as part of the food chain in this example. So again, the third order is our tertiary consumer. Fourth order is, it doesn't say this in the lesson, but it's quaternary. Quat, like Q-U-A-T, kind of like quarter, or like quad, like if you've got four, it's quad. Quadruple, like four people who are born at the same time, quadruplets, right? So we have again our producer, our primary consumer, secondary, tertiary, or first order, second order, third order. All right, so it tells us that energy flows from one level to the other through an ecosystem. It does not get recycled. That the bacteria and fungi serving as decomposers can recycle nutrients within an ecosystem as well. Here's our example of the food web. So then we look at a process of fermentation, which we also discussed in first semester. So it says most well-known matter cycles are processes involving oxygen or aerobic cycles. Many organisms, however, are able to perform respiration in the absence of oxygen through anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. They are called anaerobic because they don't require oxygen. So this is one example, sugar and yeast. In the absence of oxygen is going to yield carbon dioxide and alcohol. So in fermentation, organic compounds such as sugar are still broken down to form carbon dioxide, while the end product here is alcohol. Fermentation is a process most commonly carried out by yeast. The carbon dioxide produced is what makes breads rise. It also makes alcoholic products like beer, wine, and spirits. Let's see here. Just gonna kind of move on a little bit with this lesson and see where we end up. And I think that's kind of where we like end up with the end of this lesson. I'm just looking to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep. Looks like we've kind of covered all the main topics here in this lesson. So we will see you in the next one. We'll be getting into those trophic levels a little bit more kind of coming up in the upcoming biology lessons. That's it for this one. If you guys have questions, you know how to get in touch with me. Otherwise, have a fantastic day, everyone.